Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and with the recent release of Neon, I wanted to talk about something, specifically the balance of movement and untradeability in this game. Fortunately, when I say that, I'm not talking about this.
Ah! Oh my God. Oh shit!
I'm talking about more broadly how when people talk about threats to the long-term balance of this game, the things that you hear generally center around that infamous dev quote of how in Project A, shooting matters, and how damage abilities get out of hand, things of that sort, when the thing that a lot of people should probably be looking at is mobility and untradeability and how the creep of those mechanics within a game can prove very detrimental to its balance. Look at things like Jett for reference. With all that said, let's dive right into it. To start framing this conversation, I first wanted to look at the three major categories of mechanic that we want to talk about. Obviously, untradeability in and of itself is the first one, but then we take mobility and I want to break it into two primary branches. First, you have burst movement, which is generally going to be traveling across short distances extremely quickly, and then you have rotation acceleration, which is going to be traveling over much larger distances at a pace that doesn't really matter. It's just faster than normal walking or running. You could definitely make the case that burst movement can be used as a poor man's rotation acceleration, and that would be wholly accurate, but I think for our purposes, dividing them into two distinct silos will make a lot more sense, and we'll see why later. Now that we have these categories set, we can start looking at the actual balance of them. On an archetypal basis, these mechanics are almost strictly limited to duelists. So to take a deeper dive into that balance, I want to look at our pool of available duelist agents and see how these mechanics play into their kits, what limitations they may or may not have on them, and how presumably the presence of those skills in their various forms affect those agents' play rates. So here we have it, the duelist pool that's currently in the game. As you can see, I've chopped this out into a few different verticals. We have every agent's play rate at 2021 champions, a Boolean yes-no variable of whether or not they have a mobility skill, then the parameters around that skill. Top to bottom, those parameters are going to be what type of mobility skill it is, whether it's burst movement or rotational acceleration. Then you're going to have whether or not it has a delay channel or wind up to it. Then you're going to have where it falls within the agent's kit. Is it a signature ability? Is it an ultimate? Is it a purchasable, etc.? And then you're going to have whether or not it has a reset. Is there a kill reset? Is there a cooldown reset? Or is it just a one and done? Then you have a very similar pair of columns for untradeability, that's straight yes, no if they have it, and then the parameters around that untradeability. The first of these is going to be what type of untradeability is it? Are you getting that just by being able to move in a way that makes you untradeable? Is it via some sort of different mechanic? Then we move on likewise to mobility of whether or not there's a delay to it. Is there a channel? Is there a wind up to this? Then, again, similarly, where does it land in your kit? Is it free? Is it buyable? Is it an ultimate? And lastly, again, is there a reset, and if so, what kind of reset is it? I've intentionally ranked these top to bottom based off of that 2021 Champions play rate just to give us a really strong baseline to go off. You have Jett at the top, no surprise here to anyone. She has both burst mobility and untradeability, and not only that, they're tied into the same singular skill. Exacerbate that even further, and there's very little restrictions around it. No delay, it's a free ability, and there's a kill reset. Next up, we have Reyna, who has no mobility, but has the next strongest and most readily available untradeability mechanic. With no delay, albeit it does require a kill orb to be available, and no resets, but it comes with a free charge, so still that inherent signature ability, and you can purchase an additional one, so how much do you really need that reset? A step further down, people could probably have guessed all of these. We have Raze in the next slot, someone who has great burst mobility, but no real untradeability mechanic. The burst mobility is subject to throwing your blast packs, being able to have the sort of nuanced mechanical skill to get value out of it, and it is a purchase required ability that has no reset. So not insanely valuable, but it shows the overarching strength of burst mobility as a mechanic within the game. After Raze, we technically have a head-to-head tie between Phoenix and Yoru at a stunning 0%. I've ranked them in this order though because I know that in the events preceding Champions, Phoenix was seeing slightly more play than Yoru was. Phoenix comes in with no mobility and an untradeability mechanic that's achieved via proxy, literally just being a separate version of himself, with a channel time, but it's an ultimate. Low-cost ultimate or not, it is still way too restrictive compared to how readily two other duelists get access to that sort of skill. Obviously, it's not fair at all to compare Phoenix ulti to Reyna's ability to be untradeable, but on an overarching scale, I think it's more fair than people realize, and that leads to the play rate dynamics that we're seeing. At the end of the day, the assumed outcome and value of that skill, what you're trying to achieve with it, which is a kill and no trade in return, is still the same. Next we have Yoru, who is our first example of rotation acceleration. It's subject to the activation time, it's subject to the portal travel time, but it is a core signature ability and he does have a cooldown reset available. Even so, it's plain to see how teams assign value to rotation acceleration as a mechanic. When you stack it up against burst mobility or untradeability mechanics, it just doesn't hold water. And that will bring us to Neon. The reason I've left Neon last here is obviously we don't know what her play rate is yet, and I wanted to sort of go through the exercise of, based off of what we're seeing with the other duelists, where do we expect her to land? Right from the get-go, she's a unique beast. She has both burst mobility and rotation acceleration. She has burst mobility that's subject to her already being sprinting. We're obviously talking about her slide. But then she also has those amped up rotates in the form of, well, being able to sprint there. These are both core passive abilities to her kit, and the slide even has a kill reset. This should put her in terms of mobility either somewhere between Raze and Jett or outright at the top. Then you go on to untradeability though, and I've put this as a flat question mark, because does she have an untradeability mechanic? Yes, sort of. She technically could have untradeability via movement, but this is a tricky one because I wouldn't call Raze's ability to blast pack an untradeability mechanic, because the likelihood of her getting a kill whilst flying through the air and being difficult to trade is so low to impossible that you're not going to see it unless she really has her ultimate or lucks out. Neon, on the other hand, has a little bit more to run with, no pun intended. Her run and gun, and more aptly slide and gun, has very real kill potential, and in those situations, based off of the play that I've seen, that has a very genuine argument for being at least a soft untradeability mechanic. Presumably, as Neon's played in higher caliber ecosystems, that slide is going to be a much easier to answer mechanic. People are just going to be shooting her out of it. But as it currently stands, sliding with a Spectre or sliding with a Judge is going to net you a very hard to trade kill. Given all of this, if we believe in the hierarchy of these skills within how duelists are picked in the game right now, Neon's going to have a soft untradeability mechanic that puts her up in the same echelon as Jett and Reyna, but then also has burst mobility and rotational XL that pushes her past Reyna. There is the way more pessimistic way of looking at this, though, which is that her slide isn't an untradeability mechanic, and this may very well be the case. And then you could even look at her burst mobility and say, okay, the way that you have to already be sprinting to get access to slide is just flatly worse than someone who's reached the pinnacle of Raze's blast packs. In that case, she just ends up being a marginal upgrade to Yoru? And again, right now, all I'm talking about is the mobility and untradeability elements in these kits. We haven't brought in all of the other sauce, which obviously plays fairly significant roles in all of this. All in all, if we look at where Neon falls in this chart, having great mobility and rotational acceleration, but a very questionable untradeability mechanism, I don't see her being played a whole ton. I think that Jett's still going to be king of the castle, Reyna and Raze are still going to be vastly superior in the niches where they're currently seeing play, and so Neon's going to be mostly off of the radar until we see Jett nerfs coming through, or potentially things hitting those other agents who are superior in this mobility, untradeability duelist hierarchy. One thing that we will get from this, though, is a very clear top-to-bottom ranking of those categories that we assigned at the beginning: untradeability, burst movement, and rotational acceleration. That is a straight top-to-bottom. And given that, there are a scant few other agents in this game who have those types of abilities who are outside of the duelist silo. They're just duelist subtypes. Here we have Chamber, KAYO, and Omen. When we frame Chamber in this context, he is actually pretty terrifying. He basically has the motherlode of all burst mobility / untradeability mechanics, with the very distinct caveat that he has to set it up ahead of time. That pre-setup requirement makes it so that he can't use it in a dive format, meaning that the burst mobility element of it can only be passive and or defensive in nature. He trades the dive ability that you see with Jett's kit for longer travel distance, and by extension, the ability to accelerate his own rotates. He's tied not only burst mobility and untradeability into a singular mechanic, but all three into one. If we look at KAYO, he's basically just Phoenix 2.0. I hate to say it, any elements in Phoenix's kit that would otherwise define him as a superior duelisty agent, they're not actually defining. They both have flashes. Their sort of key element to both of them is we have a sick untradeability ultimate, and KAYO's is just better, and he has a better base kit. Last, we get to Omen, who obviously doesn't have an untradeability mechanic, but does have burst mobility and rotational acceleration in his kit, the burst mobility being his Shrouded Step and the rotational XL being his ultimate. Omen's a huge weirdo here, and I'm going to talk about him a little bit more in a minute. All of this culminates to a pretty straightforward best to worst hierarchy. In untradeability, we have Jett as the best or in a very close dead heat with Chamber, then we have Reyna, then we're going to have Neon potentially, and then you're going to have KAYO and Phoenix all in that order. In burst movement, we have Jett, Chamber, Raze, Neon, and Omen. And finally, for rotational XL, we have Yoru at the top of the food chain, Chamber, Neon, Omen, Raze, and Jett. You can aggregate all of these, and play rates actually make perfect sense. We know that untradeability is favored over burst movement, and burst movement is favored over rotational acceleration, and so where you fall within each of these silos will ultimately drive, in large part, your play rate. Phoenix only exists in this untradeability silo, the rest of his kit is very underwhelming, and even within this niche, where he's supposed to define his character, he is the worst among the pack. I think if you were to attempt to fix Phoenix, it's going to have to be something really aggressive at this point. Something debatably over the top that will probably have to get rebalanced at a future date. Maybe you make his ultimate 5 pips, or even more extreme. I've heard people talk about making his ultimate part of his core kit. What happens if it's like a 400 credit ability similar to an Aldrone, where you only have 100 health, you can't use any of your abilities, and it's half the duration of your normal ultimate, but now it's your E? How does that change his playstyle? Does that create a niche for him? Does that carve something out where he's literally just a gun that can go in over a very short period of time and maybe it auto-cancels if he gets a kill? He needs something, and he needs something badly. Next, we have Yoru, who's in a very similar sort of identity crisis. I feel like his rotational acceleration is something that's extremely cool, and it can be used in some ways like a burst movement mechanic where he can dive into backlines. I think his ability to start fighting after taking his teleports, though, really breaks his back. It isn't as flexible an ability as it should be, and rotation acceleration as a core mechanic is fairly high value at the highest levels of play, but when you're talking about solo queue Timmy, they don't give a shit. Like, being able to go to the other half of the map really fast doesn't actually help them a whole ton. So if I was piloting the ship, I would still try to lean into Yoru's whole mind game trickster thing, but you've got to do something with Gate Crash. Simply have quarter the time to draw, make it a burst mechanic as well as a rotational acceleration one, because we've already seen that there's a willingness to create that sort of power level in a mechanic. I mean, Chamber has that. He just has to preset it. So giving that to Yoru seems like a fairly natural step that isn't too far out of bounds, and I can guarantee you his play rate would go up. Next up, we have KAYO, and KAYO's fine. Like, he's not a duelist. His untradeability, his burst movement, his rotational excel, exactly where it should be. The only way that he should have access to it as a duelist subtype character is via an ultimate or a highly restrictive fashion. And now we have, yes, Omen, aka I have no idea what class I am anymore. Omen has smokes, so he must be a controller, but they're the worst smokes in the game. He also has a large area of effect flash, so maybe he's an initiator. But he also has a gimped burst movement ability, so maybe he's a duelist. What is Omen? Nobody knows. Omen needs help. Right now, he's a primary type controller, secondary type initiator / duelist, but none of them are so in a good way. If I was going to fix Omen, I'd increase his smoke duration. I would make Paranoia way worse. I would make it smaller in terms of area of effect, make it basically a linear skill shot so that you actually have to know what you're shooting at, and then I would buff the ever-living shit out of Shrouded Step. You see, I want to give Omen an actual niche for himself, and that niche would be the Opping Controller. We've got the Opping Sentinel in the form of Chamber now, we've got an Opping Duelist in the form of Jett. Well, here's your Opping Controller. And so how does that work out? Well, he's got his smokes. He's got a very narrow, linear skill shot to force opponents off of their lines so that he can pick up his. He's got an ultimate that's a cross-map translocation so that he can be where the op needs to be. And then we have Shrouded Step. I think you turn it into a proper burst movement ability, but one that's been hamstrung in a way that it makes sense for it to exist on an agent that isn't a duelist. Best example I could think of to highlight this, I'm taking the classic Wardell Peak A long on Haven. I go for my shot right now, but then I Shrouded Step back to site, and it takes forever. I'm stuck at the original location for a bunch of time, there's that stupid channel, I'm toast. Why can we not simply make it so that Omen does his Shrouded Step, instantly leaves the cast location, but then has an egregiously long channel at his endpoint? I'm talking 1.5, 2, maybe even more seconds before this sucker can do anything again. One of the commonly suggested potential nerfs to Jett was to make it so that she could only dash in the way that she's facing. We're basically giving Omen that ability and then dialing it back even further because we don't want him to just turn into a duelist that also has smokes. If you give Omen this changed kit, I think he has a very clear use case and a very clear identity. He's an agent who knows what he wants to do and now has tools that clearly accomplish that goal. Given, I think you'd have to limit Shrouded Step to a single charge, maybe a kill reset, but at the end of the day, Omen's now an actual agent that has a clear identity, a clear purpose, and his kit is well informed by the other agents in the game who have similar mechanics. His untradeability and his movement makes sense in the broader context of other movement and untradeability mechanics in the game. Alright, rant done. Raze. Raze has one of the best burst movement abilities in the game, that's why she sees the play rate that she has, but in addition to that, she has just flatly one of the most insane kits that exists. Her unique focus on sort of a mid-rangey play style with tons of zone denial and the entry by proxy that she gets from Boombot, there is nothing else like that. I think that you can compare her to Neon, who's going to have like the next best alternative to burst movement, and she will still have a very, very clear and distinct use case that Neon can't cross over into. Then we have Reyna, who's that third place in untradeability, and similar to Raze, I think she's always going to have her niche. Like, she will always be the one-tapper frag god's dream. No one else is likely ever going to be able to walk into a site, get a kill, use an untradeability mechanic, come out of it, kill someone else, and then immediately use another untradeability mechanic. The fact that she has 2 charges to this skill is her nuance, her niche, her unique shtick. Now we have Chamber, who is number 2 across all 3 categories, and that is terrifying. I've talked a bit about Chamber in the past and been like, oh, it feels a little bit like a bait agent. I feel like his kit is incredibly shallow. And then I started making this video and really started breaking into what are the specifics of powerful movement and untradeability mechanics in Valorant, and holy hell is his rendezvous OP. That said, I think it has to be because the rest of his kit is so middling. Where I was just talking about creating a kit for Omen that is very well-rounded, and I've dialed back the duelisty mechanics to make it so that he's balanced overall, Chamber almost goes the other direction, where the duelisty mechanic in his kit has been so cracked out that they've had to neuter the rest of his kit. With that said though, his duelisty mechanic, the movement, the untradeability, has still been dialed back, and in a very critical way. He can't use it offensively. It can't be thrown forward onto a site. He can't execute with it. And that's the thing that's always going to keep him very poignantly in this second slot. Next, we have the queen herself in Jett. I almost feel like I don't have to talk about this. Her untradeability is top flight. Her burst movement, top flight. If you're using it for rotational acceleration, you're either a nutcase or you've already won the round. But at the end of the day, Jett is just designed to abuse these things. We understand now that they're very critical to the overall power level in not only Jett, but duelists as an entire pool. And she is incredibly dominant in both of the most critical metrics. Last but not least, we have the new one to the scene in Neon. To reiterate and sort of elaborate a bit further on what I said earlier, I think Neon's going to have trouble finding her place. I think she falls behind Reyna in untradeability. I think she falls behind Raze in terms of burst movement. So where's her niche? She's very much so I can do it all, but I can't do anything extraordinarily well. And that's a dangerous place to be in a game where highly specialized agents seem to thrive. Like I said, I think we'll have to see nerfs coming through to other agents, or maybe even buffs to Neon, before she sees a significant place in the meta. Now we get to the actual balance part of this conversation, and it's a little bit interesting that I started this video out talking about the long-term balance concerns of most people being the significance of gunplay and abilities dealing damage, and how they should turn an eye more towards mobility and untradeability creep, and then I turn around and I say at the end of this video that the way I would change agents X, Y, and Z to be more balanced and more playable is, well, buff their mobility and untradeability. Well, that's the whole problem. The fact that I, as someone who has a fairly strong understanding of this game and has a very logic and process-based approach, thinks that the best way to make these agents more adequate in comparison to their alternatives is to immediately buff them in these two trouble categories, that's a huge issue. The fact that I can go through this process and still the most reasonable thing is to continue to creep mobility and untradeability, that is the whole reason I'm making this video. Because nobody's talking about it, and if my first instinct is to touch them, even when I'm talking about it more than almost anyone I know, that's scary to me, because I think in a game that is attack FPS, despite the fact I come from everything that isn't attack FPS, it feels like untradeability is a mechanic that almost never belonged in this game. Attack FPS is about cohesive team operation, trading efficiently, etc., etc. It feels like it should have never been here to begin with, but it's here, and it's here to stay, so we need to at least keep a track of it. You can look at Jett. Huge problem child, first year the game's been out. We're presumably about to nerf Jett a little bit to dial back how strong her ability is, but look at the last two agents we just released. Chamber, who has a strictly defensive but otherwise exclusively superior version of Jett's problem mechanic. Now we're releasing Neon, another agent who, while not having as explicit an element of untradeability, still checks all three boxes. She's got burst movement, she's got untradeability, and she's got rotational acceleration tied into all into the same part of her kit. We've got two agents back to back that both check all three boxes. If that isn't mobility creep in the eyes of analysts, developers, and pro players, it needs to be, and it needs to be discussed. Would love to hear your comments down below. A little bit of a hot button issue, definitely being overshadowed by the Ares right now for acceptable reasons. But would love to hear your guys' take. Do you think that untradeability is a huge issue in this game? What are your thoughts on the way I would potentially be changing these agents? Do you think that that's a healthy approach to untradeability and mobility? Would that be balanced within the grander context of the game? Or would that just be even further down the rabbit hole than we want to go? One last thing I wanted to talk about before I close is that I've launched YouTube memberships. Transparently, with me leaving Fnatic, I wanted to look into other forms of revenue, but in a way that wasn't just me getting money for nothing, because that's stupid. So I've launched YouTube memberships. At our second tier, you get access to my take on an agent ranked tier list. Crazy, I know, something from me that isn't related to pro play. As well as access to AMAs and a couple other cool perks. And most importantly, shoutouts in my videos. At tier 3, you get access to this, but I have two members. The first movers of everyone who even track my YouTube community page. That's the only way they would have found that. We have a tier 2 supporter in Colin Torbis and a tier 3 in Nahid Rumi. Huge thank you and shout out to them. And hopefully, many of you will be joining them shortly. Thanks as always for watching. I'll see you in the next one.